Welcome, StoicDan, to the Walled Garden podcast, and we've also got Kai Whiting here. So, Dan, I'm honored to have you on the show. I know that a few months back we kind of toyed around with the idea of having you on the show, and then I probably just got busy and forgot all about it. And then, we managed to reconvene now, and I'm really excited about this because Kai has, for many months now, been saying that you're somebody who we really should be speaking to on the podcast, and so. I'm so glad to have Kai here and yourself. And so, yes, Stoic Dan, would you like to just introduce yourself and tell us and the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do and perhaps why you're here on the show?
Sure. Well, I discovered Stoicism in my life about 7 years ago. And it was a small group called the Orlando Stoics. It had been started by a college student. And very briefly, he was able to be organizer for a while, but then he had to move away. And when I stepped up to be organizer, I just found that it naturally came to, it appealed to the skills that I had and my interests in philosophy. And so over the years now, I basically have been able to take the group through a series of evolutions in the books that we read, the topics that we cover. We've tried videos, we've tried dialogues. I also make it easy for people to join the group because they don't have to read in advance. I have these outlines that I hand out either in person or now in the pandemic, it's usually an outline on the screen. So now, fast forward to 7 years later, I've also spoken about Stoicism to other groups. I've had the privilege of speaking at Stoicon conferences. I think that's where I met Kai. I think it was 2018 in London. I remember, I think you were speaking before me at that podium in the main room. And I think that's where I came across you the first time. But it's been a great experience learning about philosophy through the perspectives of the Stoic scholars. And as you'll see today, I'll also be talking about the other areas that I enjoy talking about, connecting Stoicism to Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. There's so much great knowledge out there. And of course, in areas of science, consciousness, and psychology. So that's a brief summary of what I've been doing.
Yeah, amazing. And it is really incredible to see that, the Orlando Stoics have 1,700 members. Is that right? And that's...
Yeah, we passed 1,700. And I'm also the organizer for the Daytona Stoics and the Tampa Stoics, so we've got in Florida, we've got a lot of activity going on. And I also organize some other philosophy groups in Buddhism, minimalism, and general philosophy.
Yeah, and obviously quite a feat there. And I guess what I want to start off with is, I'll start off with a question and then I'm going to throw it over to Kai to dive into perhaps a conversation around the Stoic theology, which is, I think, the basic focus that we want to be looking into today. But so to those who are listening now who may not have heard of you, they're thinking Stoic Dan. You put Stoic in front of your name, and that's how people know you. And you seem to have really found a home within the Stoic philosophy. And I'm always interested in people's origin stories of how they kind of came to, or perhaps why this philosophy gels with them so much. And particularly with somebody like you who wants to put Stoic in front of your name, I mean, it really gels with you, right? So, how did you perhaps come to become so interested in Stoic philosophy, and why is it the place where you have found home, I guess?
Well, a couple of things. I think my gateway was Buddhism because I did study it weekly for a few years before I found Stoicism. And I felt that Buddhism was like a 75% match for me. But when I found Stoicism, I felt this was like 95% plus. It was a very close match to the things I wanted to believe. And also the way that I saw life and the universe as a creature or an organism, you might say, almost like Spinoza's God, which we're going to get into, I'm sure, that the Stoic idea or concept of a God is something that I do connect very much with Spinoza's view that God is nature, is the universe, and vice versa. And I think that it's also fascinating to me to see across different systems of thought, like whether it's Buddhism or Taoism, or even, excuse me, the American Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau and Fuller. They believe very much in the idea of things that connected. They were not only influenced by the Stoics, but the way that they talk about developing oneself, developing your virtue, your individuality, your potential, I think agrees very much with Stoicism. So it's I haven't come across the single unifying theory yet, but I love connecting the dots, and that's what I've been doing with these different systems.
Well, look, I have many questions that I would like to ask after that, but I'm going to throw it over to Kai, and I really want Kai to jump in here and take us on a wild adventure through the mind of Stoic Dan. So, Kai,
I always have to start with a controversial question, right?
Yeah, you do.
So I do. You know me too well. So my controversial question is, Stoic Dan, in a sense that in my book, co-authored book, Being Better, in chapter 8, we talk quite strongly about the Stoic God, aspects of Islam, aspects of Christianity, and yet that seems to be a rabbit hole that people find, unfortunately, not only some of them find it intriguing, but the unfortunately is that a lot of people don't find it intriguing, and they find that there is no space in contemporary Stoic practice, which they might call modern Stoicism, for the wonder that Posidonius had when he walked out into nature, and the wonder that you were just talking about, looking at the all-encompassing theory, which is what Posidonius was trying to do. So my question to you, the controversial question is, and you can weigh up how you want to answer it, is why do you think that there is such a quickness within the modern Stoic part of the contemporary Stoic movement to dismiss the wonder of the Logos, or the wonder in terms of spirituality, as opposed to a sort of scientific, cold sense of reason?
Well, thinking about the way the scholars present this, and I've been lucky to connect with a lot of different scholars over the years, Massimo and Donald Robertson, Chris Fisher. They do have varying ideas, and they seem to be aware of each other. I think that one of the aspects that perhaps, as you say, dismisses the wonder is because the modern Stoicism movement seems to have a lot of secular themes that run through it. And of course, when people want to present things in a secular way, that would be devoid of the divinity. But I do like thinking back to the original, the original things that the ancient Stoics thought about, both in the Greek and Roman period, 300 BC to 200 AD. In that period, there was talk of pneuma, and there was talk of the breath and the fire. I think that sometimes we simplify that for example, in the Orlando Stoics, we sometimes simplify that and talk about the Logos as the fire that's inside all of us, the life force that's in us. The pneuma is sometimes translated as almost the same thing. But if we do look a little bit deeper, I think we'll see that these two ingredients were viewed, that is the breath and the fire together, were viewed by the ancient Stoics as that life-giving force or ingredient. And I think that that's not just present throughout the Stoic teaching. We can connect it in a lot of ways, but we can also think about it, going back, if I remember right, Zeno even had a description of fire and defining it as some kind of intelligent spirit. I think, I think Cleanthes, the second school leader, also added to Zeno's definition of that fire, let's see. Oh yeah, that's right. Cleanthes added something that led to the Christian Holy Spirit thing. I remember there's some connection there. There was an Anglican priest who described Cleanthes' description as leading to the Holy Spirit. I have in the Christian version, but I haven't researched it too much. So I think there's a lot of great material there. And one of my friends, Chris Fisher in Tampa, I think has described it that the divinity is an important part of the modern Stoicism movement, but he's, I think, in the minority there. So.
Yeah, I think that's why Chris Gill said to me that I should use the terminology contemporary Stoics and then have like the modern and the traditional branch. I think you're right that there is for some reason, and I don't know the reason. I'm not saying that anybody really knows the reason, but there is this sense of we must be secular in order to appeal to the quote masses, quote unquote. We must be secular because we cannot, we want to be as open as possible to whoever comes to our doors or, our colonnade, perhaps. And so I do understand sort of this, it's a very Western idea of if as secular as we can make it, we make ourselves open to more people. And in my impression, and it is only impression, is that sometimes it goes too far. So instead of saying, okay, we're secular because we want a sort of sense of openness, it has become sometimes, not always and not every individual associated with one Stoicism, that this has got to be secular. It has to be maintained as secular. And anybody who carries the baggage, that's the terminology that I've seen in a lot of places, the baggage of the Stoic God is just complicating matters. They're poking their finger on a sore, right? So, or a wound of some description. And I think that Chris Fisher might smile when he hears me say that. So I do think you're absolutely right that there is this sort of inclination, this affinity, as it were, for secular expressions of Stoicism. But in your estimation, what do we lose when we aren't secular merely just so that we're in terms of we don't associate specifically with a particular religion, but we're secular in the full sense of the word, that we actually remove any sense of divinity, whether that divinity be religious, quote unquote, rather than spiritual? What do you think it is we lose when we are that level of secular?
Well, I would say that thinking back on all the discussions that we had before the pandemic in Orlando Stoics, we used to meet twice a week, Mondays and Fridays. We would have people from all different religions, plus atheists and agnostics, attend. And I think that what we've lost is that I realized that by presenting things in a secular way, I did appeal to everyone, but a Christian or a Muslim could attend my group and still have a fascination with what is the Stoic God. Even though in their religion, they have their own concepts of that and their own ways of describing God, but they could easily come to our group and be interested in learning how does a Stoic think about it. And I think that we could have added more descriptions of the Stoic God. We could have taught classes around it. I think maybe we did miss something there, and that's something I can try in the future. But I know that once in a while, here's the balancing act as a meeting organizer, is once in a while you will have, when you bring up the Stoic God or some divinity like that, you will have someone who is more religious or maybe easily offended in the group. And then they may start talking about their version of the God and take over the meeting. So you have to still keep things in balance.
Absolutely. And I think that on a practical level, that has certainly happened in the modern Stoicism organization. I think where I personally draw the line is when certain individuals would say that the Stoic God or the divinity, or in the Stoic sense of the term, has no validity whatsoever, adds nothing to the Stoic journey towards eudaimonia. To what extent would you say that having that, what I would call a blind spot, prevents them potentially from enjoying some aspects of that Stoic journey? Because I feel that the ancient Stoic journey definitely was inspired by their sense of the divine, their sense of wonder. What do you think that one might lose? And it may be a might, because we can't say that they definitely would, but what would one lose potentially by shutting their eyes to the possibility of a divine?
I think I can give two different examples of this. The first is the term cosmopolitanism that we use freely now in modern Stoicism, how we should treat each other, how we value each other. Practicing virtue, of course, is a part of that equation. And I think that we could link that easily to a Stoic God in a modern sense, showing us why are we, or why should we be cosmopolitan in all ways. And also, here's a second thing that we don't hear in Stoicism, is the term Panpsychism. I've been giving over the last few months, I've given a series of 15 lectures on consciousness and neuroscience and panpsychism. And, panpsychism believes that there is a mind-like attribute in all things, much like the pneuma from Stoic beliefs. Pneuma is a part of every living creature, every plant, even in a rock. There's some element of pneuma. And the same can be said for panpsychism, that even a rock has some kind of idea in it. I think it was Bertrand Russell who said something like that, that there's an idea inside every object, even an inanimate thing like a rock. But if we want to explore panpsychism as another related idea to cosmopolitanism today, how should we be acting? How should we be treating our planet? Should I be vegan? Because I don't want to kill an animal, another thing that might have a mind or a consciousness at some level. I think that these areas are worth exploring and can give us a greater sense of how should I be behaving in this world, whether I'm Stoic or not.
I think that's a wonderful answer. I think it's very nice. And I would be inclined to agree with you, which is why Leonidas and I and a couple of other people added the circle of concern, the environment, right? To take into consideration the fact that the Stoics did understand that a rock had its place and it had a reason to be there, right? Which some of us might seem, will chuckle because it seems so strange to use that kind of language. But I do feel that, for example, a lot of the challenges we are facing in the environmental sense is because we do exploit the land. We do mine, and we mine the things we think we want, right? And some of the things we definitely need, right? In terms of if we value our health. But sometimes we mine for things that we don't actually need, that we are told in the conveyor belt of life that if we can just have more stuff, or the tread, the hedonic treadmill, we would be happy. And how many people, for example, have a very, very big car, not because they need to go from A to B, but because they feel the need to keep up with the Joneses, to keep their status. And I find that this Stoic sense of reason would at least ask, lead us to ask, do I really need this car? What do I need it for? Why do I need it? To what extent do I need it? What other options are there available to me, if not now, within the foreseeable future? Because although the future does not exist in Stoicism from an epistemological perspective, you still have to think right now, what are the implications of my decisions that I take? It would make no sense. We're not consequentialists. We still have to think about what the consequences might be, because that is reasonable to do so. But I can kind of hear, if I'm playing devil's advocate, I can kind of hear somebody saying, well, I'm secular and I still care about the environment, and I still live according to reason. So I don't feel that the need to be complicated by the baggage of the word God. What would you say to somebody who would have that, not objection, but at least that observation?
Yeah, I would say that we've included this in our discussions locally, and one of the ways I often respond to that is that the transcendentalists like Thoreau and Emerson and Fuller, they would caution us to be careful about society, telling us that society may give us some great benefits, but it also can be a distraction to us. It can tell us that we should be going in this direction when instead we should be looking over here, because maybe the wisdom of the herd is not always so wise. Maybe the herd is sometimes just doing what is easy. And so we need to be careful of that. And this is where I think philosophy really comes in handy, because we can re-examine, those things that you mentioned, like a car. Why do I need this? Or why do I need a new one of these every year? Why should I be upgrading my smartphone? So I should question these things. And philosophy does give us a great, a landscape of things that we should be considering. Instead of just going with the herd, we can then think about what are the elements, what is this very nature, as the Stoics say, living according to nature. Remember that phrase? We hear it over and over again, but of course, we can't pinpoint exactly what it is. We can only research into thinking about what is the nature of life, and how, on this call, Simon, you and me, we all have different backgrounds, but if we research this and look carefully, we may be able to find what really is it to be a human being. And I should be treating Simon better than I did because last week I said something, or I wasn't thinking clearly. And if we can somehow get to those underpinnings, I think that we can do a lot better. There's in thinking about the pneuma and the fire for today's talk, I did research a little bit into the, those AA long books, the two red ones, the two red volumes on Hellenistic philosophy. There's a quote in there by Stobaeus, and he's quoting Zeno. And Zeno is saying that the fire has two purposes. The sun and the moon are the first form of fire, and they do have a form of intelligence. But then there's another form of the fire which comes in plants and animals, and that is what causes growth and preservation. It makes you think about what is life, and even the cosmos itself has a kind of intelligence or underpinning to it. But every year that I study this, I think I'm getting closer. I'm going to understand it a little better.
I think that's
sorry. I want to dive in here because Kai, you're kind of also asking about, how does the Stoic God as a framework for understanding the world around us, perhaps even lead us to wanting to take better care of the environment around us and things like that. And Dan, I think that you actually hit on a really important point that we could maybe dive into here when you were talking about panpsychism as well, and seeing that there is some kind of life or mind even within the rock. This is something that I remember Alan Watts talking about, how, we're kind of nested within a very tiny, minute time and place within an infinite cosmos. And so it's easy for us to kind of look around and think, well, this is just how things are, right? But when you get into these more metaphysical concepts and you start to realize that we really are in that river that Heraclitus talked about, where everything is constantly at all times infinitely, morphing and changing and growing. And, I think back to my time when I was growing up on the farm and they were, building the driveway on the farm. And so they scraped a whole bunch of dirt back and found a whole bunch of volcanic rock. And it's like, that's rock now, but at one point it was molten lava, so at one time it is completely hard, and, and another time it's just like water, and I think that when we talk about, how do people come to this understanding of the Stoic God, it seems to me, and I want to know both of your thoughts on this, it seems to me like there must be when we dive deeper into these metaphysical and theological concepts of Stoicism, there must accompany with that learning a kind of spiritual transformation. And the word that I think best describes that is the world becomes reanimated. You know, we look around us and we realize that there is divinity constantly around us because everything is at all times growing and changing and morphing. And it does reanimate the world for us. And I wonder if maybe both of you could comment on, have you experienced some sort of transformation within yourself in terms of the way that you see and experience the world around you as a result of understanding these principles on a deeper level?
Would you like to go first, Kai?
Thank you. I would certainly say that the Stoic God and the theology that the cosmology and theology that underpins that has enabled me to expand my mind. Not so much that my brain falls out, right? But certainly to expand my mind to different possibilities. And that's not to say that the secular viewpoint is so narrow-minded that one cannot learn or grasp something very significant. However, I do think that having a secular framing does prevent you from asking certain worthwhile questions. And that's, I think, we're getting when StoicDan was answering the questions, that what he was grasping for. He was saying, this is like, he was turning my question on its head because he was being very diplomatic. And he was like, this is what I see with the Stoic God, right? Because I was loading the gun kind of thing and seeing how he would handle it. He did what I expected him to do, knowing well enough to know he would do that. So the ability to look at the problem, to wrestle it, if it was like a cube in one's head that one wanted to flip over and look at, I feel that I can do that by having the concept of the Stoic God tied to the ethics. The minute I remove the root of Stoicism, which is the Stoic God, I find that I have a very flat surface and it becomes very self-helpy, right? And there's no criticism of that. I'm like, if you don't feel the need to have any part or any aspect of Stoic theology and Stoicism, that's up to you. But you have morphed it into something much flatter. And in my view, much less interesting, because then you start saying living according to nature, right? Even the secular Stoic will say, or the secular influenced person influenced by Stoicism perhaps to be secular. So what do you mean by that? You're saying living according to nature. For you, nature is inanimate. For you, nature, the logos in Stoicism is meaning and creates all meaning. For you, there is no meaning, right? There is no meaning other than the meaning that you make for yourself, which would be a Lawrence Becker kind of idea of we make our own sense of meaning, and then we have our values, and then we understand what's virtuous based on our values. But if I value killing people in a very efficient manner, that would make me an excellent sniper, right? So it would be very hard. It's very hard from secular Lawrence Becker position to argue that being a good sniper, being an excellent sniper is great for the to say, if I argue maybe being an excellent sniper isn't excellent for the cosmopolis, it's very hard for you to argue against me, because you would say, well, based on my values, it makes sense. I'm like, yeah, but where do your values come from? And they'll say, from society. And then Dan would say, well, how do you know that the herd is going in the right direction, right? How do you know that is appropriate? Just because society makes a lot of collective decisions, and we know full well from the environmental devastation that 186 companies have made decisions for society which have tied us to fossil fuels, that have created cities in the US where you have to have a car, right? These decisions were made for society by specific individuals, and we just take it as society therefore wants the car. But in Europe, people don't have that kind of viewpoint. They want to be next to a metro station. So we kind of feel like whoever made these vested interests, must be what society has decided. Even if it was 200 years ago and it was 5 or 6 men, they were typically men sitting in a room deciding how best they can make money. And then 50 years later, they're all dead. And you have to go, well, that's a societal preference, right? And that's why I struggle with a purely secular Stoicism, for me, it isn't Stoicism. It's something else. And that's what Becker says himself. And there's nothing wrong with that. I have no worries if people say, I'm influenced by Stoicism and I take this aspect or I take another aspect. I stick it to my life. It's really useful. I find it really challenging that someone sort of cuts the legs out from underneath the Stoic God and says, but I still want to call it Stoicism. And I'm like, why do you want to call it that? Well, why are you so attached to that label? And that's ironic, isn't it? When you say, you don't like me using the word or label God, the signifier God, you find that really difficult, but you feel the need to cling on to the term Stoicism for some reason, even though you've morphed it into your own image beyond what I think is reasonable within the frameworks that the ancient Stoics have set. I don't know, Dan, you probably have.
I have to respond to that quickly, and then Dan, I want you to comment. I have to.
Go on.
But okay, I just find it very interesting that when we talk about the spiritual transformation, perhaps of moving into this worldview, the way that I discuss it is, reanimating the world, nature, being in nature, seeing that everything is alive, and that's because I'm a very artistic person. That's just where I get my joy. But you talk to an academic like yourself, you talk about it in terms of the expansion of the mind, more complex thinking, things like that. It's just very interesting, that difference there. But I wonder if people at home might be thinking that what you're saying here is that once you enter the kind of cosmopolitan worldview, all of your values will naturally stack up and you'll know, like, this is exactly what you will think. So, you will start to question whether or not it is right to be a sniper. But I don't necessarily know if I agree that there is such a clear-cut line between what the cosmopolitan worldview will say of moral values and what the secular worldview will say. I mean, I could list many, many reasons why you might definitely need a really good sniper as a part of your community. If we talk about protecting certain values and we talk about, not everybody is allowed in, you can't just let everybody into this, So I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where you're going there, but I do want to chuck Stoic Dan in here, and Kai, if you want to come back later with any sort of thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the words we've been using, like transformation, and at a greater level, what values help us achieve that transformation in our lives? Because this is something Stoics have been talking about for a long time, is making yourself, improving oneself. I think that if Epictetus were alive today, he would be a great motivational speaker. He'd be making the rounds on those stages with other, with Tony Robbins and all the rest. He would have his bit to say as well. Now, thinking about this transformation, two very inspiring things for me in this area of transformation is, first of all, Marcus Aurelius, my favorite quote in all of Meditations is 2.1, where he talks about how every day he's going to get up, he's going to meet people who are obnoxious, brutish, whatever his words are, I forget what they are. But instead of pointing the finger at them in the end of that paragraph and saying, look how bad they are, no, he says they are like me. They are making mistakes like me. They're trying to live just like me. That is a very big transformational statement for an emperor, no less, to make. He could say, I'm great, I'm accomplished, whatever. No, but he says they're just like me. I'm making mistakes along with them. Therefore, I should be forgiving. I should help them improve. I should help them get through this moment. And then a lesser known thing comes from Rousseau in the 1700s, where he had been influenced, in the writing of The Social Contract, famous book. He had been influenced by Hobbes and Locke, but he disagreed with those guys on one area, I believe, which is that all men are brutish and, therefore making life terrible and short, that kind of phrasing. And I think that instead, what Rousseau was saying is that we all have virtue. Besides these, maybe a brutish quality in there somewhere, we're also all people. We have virtue as an underpinning. And therefore, that is how I think we can view each other as community, that we should rally around that virtue and realize that we can treat each other better.
can we touch on that idea of virtue? I think that's a beautiful reminder that, both touching on this idea of we all have our virtue, but also Marcus Aurelius is talking about how we all, including myself, have our vice. We're a mixture of both, certainly. But I wonder how virtue, perhaps with capital V, relates to, the Stoic God framework. Because I've not yet fully understood. Some people will say that virtue is it's one thing. It's a completely separate thing. It is the Stoic God in one sense. And I wonder if maybe both of you could comment on that or talk about it amongst yourselves.
Yeah, let me go first on this one because something just sprang into my mind that really I think answers this well. The idea that virtue connected to the Stoic God, I think that not only is virtue what we're all seeking as Stoics, but it helps us live according to nature and live well with other people, live in harmony with other people. Like those circles that we know, first you live well with your family, then your town, then your state, then your country, your vanity. Those things have been drawn, those circles were redrawn for the modern Stoicism movement, and that's a good thing. But what I'm getting to is that virtue is like the driving force underneath that. And sometimes it's not clear what I should do right now, choice A or B, which is the more virtuous. But I have discovered over the years a very interesting attribute of virtue, which is that it has no unit of measure. Virtue can be a little bit of virtue or a big virtue, but as long as you're achieving virtue, you're going in the right direction. And I got to develop that idea a little bit more.
It's kind of like virtue is virtue by definition. And so if you're practicing virtue, then you're by definition not practicing vice. You're in that point.
Right. And in that way, because we're talking about the Stoic God today, which could be the underlying reason or rationality in all things, you would be going at least in the right direction. And I'm going to make an interesting pop culture reference now. I recently saw the movie called Nightmare Alley with Bradley Cooper. And I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but I will say that in that film, his character, he's having a lot of difficulty in life. He finally finds the direction he wants to go in, that his talents are suited for, and he pursues that and he gets better and better. And at some point, it goes too far. And he realizes that he's doing this. He's realizing that the path he's on, he's no longer contributing to the world. He's doing wrong. And he knows this, but he still keeps going. And that brings him to a very dark place at the end of the movie. That's all I'm going to say. But it's I think that could be, if I spelled it all out and gave the movie away, it would be a good example of why we seek virtue.
I want you to jump in there.
Yeah, I think like when going back to, because you asked me about the sniper, I'm not convinced that human values per se, if you remove the Stoic God, do lead us to virtue. I just don't see evidence for that. So when I say excellent sniper, maybe I should use the word, because the word excellence is tied to virtue and Stoicism, a sniper who will do their job very well. For a sniper who believes in the Stoic God, their body does not belong to them. It belongs to the cosmopolis. So it's not enough. You wouldn't call yourself an excellent sniper if you're only really good at targeting somebody in a certain way. Let's put it that way, as opposed to I do this for the good of the community. Because I think secular Stoics will say to me, but virtue's always been there and that's a human value and we strive for it. And I'm like, is such and such a company striving for virtue, or are they striving for profit?
Well, also, like for most of our human history, the way that we strove towards virtue was built into a religious or a theological framework. So you can't just say, well, we've always strived towards it, so I can just live in a secular way and still strive towards virtue, because we're in the 1% and 99% of the rest of our history was built into that framework.
Yeah. Or what, either religious or a spiritual. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So when we say that secular values would lead us to virtue, no one's ever explained to me how that would happen. They'll say things like, well, humans will come to agreement and that will happen. Well, we've come to an agreement on a lot of things, like we should have a World Cup every 4 years for what Americans would call soccer and I would call football. We have an agreement that the Super Bowl is once a year and they're world champions, even though they don't actually play anybody outside of the US, right? So we've come to an agreement on a lot of things, and that's progress, right? There is certainly progress. To go back 200 years and try to come to an agreement on anything in terms of big nations. But I don't think I can't think of any summit where we've come to the conclusion that we should be striving for virtue. I just haven't seen it. And I haven't even seen that within one particular country. So, okay, then let's just talk about the West, because, let's say other countries outside the West, they have a different view of what that means. Okay. But no one sat in a secular manner, as far as I'm aware, and said, this is what we're going to talk about in this conference. We're going to talk about how humanity, without any sense of religious institutions or spirituality, can strive for virtue. I just haven't seen it. So I'm very reluctant to swallow that pill when I look at the back of the packet and I look at the instruction and go, but there's no mention of this. I want this painkiller for a headache, but it doesn't even look like a painkiller to me. I don't know what this is. It's medication, but doesn't look like it says what it is what it says it will do. And so I struggle from the secular point of view. And they'll say to me, yes, but how do you know, that Stoic God is correct and that's the right, quote unquote, right thing to believe? I said, well, the Stoic ethics are based on there being a Stoic God. So you're still swallowing the ethics. You're swallowing it for no reason. According to your own sort of justification, there is no Stoic God. The Stoics the ancient Stoics would say, these ethics make sense because the Stoic God is like this. Without the Stoic God, the ethics don't work, because that's why the ethics, they come out of the cosmology. So I find it just very strange to go, I want to practice Stoicism, Stoic ethics, but I don't want to acknowledge in any way a divine being. But the entire ethical framework is based on a divine being. In the same way that I would say, you can say that you're Christian, but you don't believe in Jesus Christ, and you think he was just a normal person, was not the Son of God, didn't die on a cross. I'm like, but I'm a Christian because I like the ethics. But the entire ethics of Christianity are based on the fact that Jesus Christ happens to be the Son of God who commits the ultimate sacrifice. If you don't believe that, why would you follow the ethics? That's my, I don't know, StoicDan, if you have anything to say on that. Or Simon, indeed.
Sure, I can. I'll say something briefly. I remember in my early days of Stoicism, I was reading Marcus Aurelius, his Meditations, and it struck me as interesting that very often he would say, whether you believe in the divinity or not, here's the answer. It's the same answer either way. And that I often go back to that, even though the scholars have since revealed to me that Marcus was a religious guy. But the way he phrased those things shows me that in terms of this ethics and the Stoic God that you're talking about, I believe that the idea that the spark from the universe, the logos, the pneuma, whatever, if that comes to us as a spark that represents reason and living in harmony, living according to nature almost, I think that you can have that spark, you can accept it, that without a Stoic God on your horizon, you can say, yes, I'm here now. I admit that I'm here, I'm living, I'm thinking, I'm listening to you, I'm learning something. That spark is undoubtedly here. And I don't have to have a Stoic God to believe that. So that's how I would say that can take me forward and lead to all the virtue and the ethics. What would you add, Simon?
Well, I guess I want to keep on asking you about this, Dan, because, okay, so Kai, I think if I put myself in the shoes of a secular Stoic, what I personally am going to be hearing in your response is you've got to believe a lie or a story in order to then build upon that what it is that we all believe is true, or at least I've got to believe in some sort of miraculous thing, and then build upon that the Tower of Stoicism. And I kind of think, well, we live in a time where I don't necessarily think that we should always be approaching religious or theological questions from the framework of science. I don't think that they're the same thing, and they shouldn't necessarily be trying to figure out the same questions. But nonetheless, with the kind of physics that's happening today, that people are starting to understand, and the scientific discoveries about the nature of say consciousness and the nature of being and all this sort of stuff. I mean, like, there's enough out there that we can at least look to that and say, like, look at the commonalities that flow throughout history, and how perhaps a lot of this is founded upon these ancient Greek ideas and these ancient ideas of what the nature of reality is. And I just wonder, Dan, you talk about how you really try to incorporate scientific knowledge and new discoveries into your understanding of these various philosophies. Have you come across any interesting discoveries recently that can help us to understand perhaps a little bit better the idea or the cosmological framework that the Stoics had, or the Stoic God that they believed in?
Well, I would reintroduce the term of panpsychism that we mentioned already. Yeah. I think that this area, in addition to Stoicism, is a quickly expanding area in modern thought. And it does really cross the lines of science and religion. But the idea that panpsychism can make you think about that everything has a mind-like attribute in it. We often start with the question, oh, you're vegan. Well, if you're a panpsychist, now you may believe that the plant also suffers when you harvest the plant or you eat the plant. And then what about smaller things? What about the virus in the pandemic? Does it have a mind-like attribute? Does it want to live? Does it have consciousness? And then here's the third area that I find fascinating, is because I work in the field of technology, software design. I sometimes think about the future of robotics and AI. People have been hyping it up a lot in last 20 years. And by some accounts, it should have taken over the planet already, like Terminator, and James Cameron and all the rest. So, but that hasn't happened yet. And yet the question will come. It's been presented in nice, interesting sci-fi movies that, maybe a certain robot, when it achieves sentience, do we have the right to turn it off?
Kai, what would you say to that? You're looking at that from a Stoic point of view. Gosh.
Yeah, I have. Well, I did think about
answer
writing
the
a paper
most difficult question in the world that you only just got then.
We were going to think. Well, we did a little bit with the Neanderthal about what when Chris Gill, Fred Sadler, Leonidas Konstantakos, and I wrote about Stoicism from a perspective of Neanderthal, in the sense that what is human? What is it that makes us human? Is it that we have 2 hands and 2 legs, and is that it? Is it our conscious attributes? If a robot has those qualities, are they somewhat human? At what point are they, one or the other? And so we kind of tried to answer that kind of question about, would a Neanderthal have a sage, and what would the sage look like, basically? And we did come to the conclusion that their sage would be different, right? The sage would be different, but that they were still able to reason. So we did think about doing this particular paper, but I think at the moment, with the quest for singularity, I think there's still a lot of unknowns. So a more interesting paper to me would be, at what point for example, can you no longer be a sage? So if you were a sage and then you've got Alzheimer's, are you still a sage, right? That, I think that's also a sort of sense of the consciousness. What is it that we can say that's reason if we can crystallize it? So I mean, just going back quickly to your other statement and playing devil's advocate of the secular Stoic, I mean, they would say what you're asking me to believe is in something that is a lie, for example. And I would say, why would you believe that? I know that was a bad
choice of words, but
was, okay. Yeah. But they might say that. They might say that.
Yeah.
Or a fairy tale. And I'd say, well, with the 4 virtues, why do you believe that? Maybe that's a lie. maybe there's 10 virtues. But why settle on 4, right? What evidence?
But see, the fact that they might be a lie doesn't negate the fact that the first thing that you want them to believe in would, Well, so I guess my point is, like, I'm very fascinated by, a few really interesting teachers, perhaps even on YouTube, people who, I'm talking about, like, there's this really fascinating guy, Ken Wheeler, right? Really, just a really fascinating dude who goes deep into, like, ancient metaphysics of Buddhism and even Christianity and things like that. And listen, I'm going to be the first to say that I don't understand half of the words that he uses, right? But nonetheless, he seems to think that he has happened upon certain Neoplatonic ideas that do really give us a framework to view the world that is based on facts, logic, reason, wisdom, that really do build up the structure of everything, that give him such a firm understanding of what reality is. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily believe or do not believe, not that matters, and I'm not even saying that I understand what he's saying, but the point is that there are people out there who even in religions and Christianity and stuff like that, it's like they believe that they have fundamental logical, capacity to make sense of these things on a firm foundation, rather than simply saying, well, this is the framework and it has to be built on the Stoic God, because if it doesn't, then it falls apart. Well, I mean, that's kind of like a castle floating in the air, but you have to have some sort of firm foundation to even come to the conclusion of the Stoic God. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm wondering if we can give something more tangible to hold on to.
I mean, A.A. Long said the firm foundation is the Stoic theology, but and A.A.
There's
Long,
a logic to it, right? Like, how did they even come to that understanding?
It's basically like, but you have to, whatever you believe in anything, you have to pitch your tent somewhere. You have to set up a premise. So the Stoics set up the premise that the theology to them made sense, that there was a Stoic God, and therefore the ethics.
See, when you say makes sense, what you mean by that, I'm assuming, is that it makes sense because there's a logical foundation to it. It's not just saying, well, okay, so we've got a Stoic God.
Well, from a perspective of the logos, yes, because the logos is meaning. Without the logos, for example, I was having a debate on Facebook where they said, oh, I feared you were going to say that. When I said the only life, from a Stoic perspective, the only life that has intrinsic value is this living being. If we don't take the Stoic God as a living being, is the sage, because the sage is reason. Now, logos is meaning. By definition, the logos is meaning and gives meaning. It is not created by natural law. Is not created by God. It is God. So take away the logos from the Stoic perspective, take away meaning. So that's what that's the meaning. The whole thing is the scaffold of the tent, the way that it's pitched. Like, you can put the fabric on, which I would say is like the ethics. You can throw it on there and you can develop it and you can make it into a very beautiful looking tent. But the fact that the Stoics are very clear that reason is the logos. Logos is meaning. Logos, another word for Stoic God, because I know it's the word Stoic God. People are like, I don't want to use that word. Okay, then use logos, use intellect, use whatever you want. You take away if you take away logos, right? If you take away that concept in Stoicism, there's no place that I can hang my Christmas jumper. Right? There's nothing I can put it on, because the entire concept of Stoicism requires, by literally definition, the logos is written. Logos. So it's like,
and that I think, Kai, is what I'm trying to get at here. Is it seems like yours is a kind of, it comes off at least as somewhat of a top-down approach, saying, okay, we've got this Stoicism, but it's hanging on all of this, so you have to go down and, like that. There's a bottom, and then you fall into the depths of unknowing and confusion and all this sort of stuff. But this is where I might want to bring Dan back in, because so when you say, okay, meaning make it, we have the potential to we have the unique human capacity to observe, to make, to understand, to see what is happening all around us, and to draw the connections, right? And Dan, you earlier mentioned something to the tune of, the fact that we're here talking to each other. It's like, it's happening, like this is happening. And I wonder if that has to do with, was there a point where somebody kind of woke up and said, oh my gosh, like we can see, we can experience, we can understand, we can look around, we can draw connections, all of this sort of stuff. And that means something. It means that we are, the way that I would put it is, we are the eyes and the ears and the sensory experience of the God, like we are seeing as a part of that body you might call the Stoic God. And I wonder, Dan, I'm not sure if there's any sort of congruency in my thoughts here, but I want to just get you to jump in here, and any thoughts on what we've been saying so far.
Sure. I enjoyed the way both of you described the foundation, or the way that Stoicism is a structure. And I once heard Massimo say something like that every element in Stoicism is supported by the other elements. And that makes it a system that you can believe in. Now, I would go a step further, and I'd say, think about those 4 cardinal values: wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. That's one way that we can guide ourselves and think of ourselves as like Seneca writing in his journal every evening. Was I just today? Was I temperate? You can evaluate yourself with those 4 things. And yet, I will now boldly say that maybe I'm working on the 5th Stoic virtue, which is focus. I think that for the modern age, focus is something that is not covered by wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Maybe a little bit of overlap, but I'm going to develop that for this coming year's Stoicon annual conference. Maybe if I develop it right and it resonates with others, maybe they'll let me speak. But once in a while, this is just like, I think Marcus Aurelius said something like that. If you know of a 5th one, let me know, because I want to hear it. That's that openness to new ideas and thinking outside the box. I think that's a part of our Stoic tradition as well.
Kai?
I think that reminds me of being Sharon Lebell and I having a massive debate. I knew you'd be thinking of that. I guess I'm a traditionalist in all sense of the term, in terms of, I still believe that I would say focus is incredible part and important, but I would highlight that it's probably linked into temperance. I would say that it doesn't get enough ink focus, and I don't think it's in terms of time, I think it's in terms of attention. Like, people think, I'll be focused for an hour, right? And it's not about time. It's literally, I'm going to focus to do this task. And so I'm very reluctant to add any virtue, but I would say that I think that StoicDan is correct to highlight that focus is being lost in the contemporary Western world. And I would say that focus is being lost because of the limited connection we have with the divine and each other. If we are part of the divine, because we have things like, and unfortunately we have COVID, and we have a very sort of hourly processing mind, right? So I was telling you in a text message actually about a book I'm listening to that Eve Richards, who also talks about Stoicism, was telling me about, that in the medieval period, you used to ask somebody how long something took, and they'll say it takes the amount of time to urinate. It takes the same amount of time as to milk a cow, right? Because you didn't have a concept really of it takes an hour, right? So I think StoicDan is onto something by saying perhaps we should be task orientated. So we're not looking at, he already held it up. We're not looking at our phone because our task right now is to have this conversation, or our task right now, if we're listening to this podcast, is to make tea for our family, right? And I think if that's the issue with focus, and I've seen it particularly with young Generation Z, where they are unable to really work on one task at one time because we're told, oh, okay, we need to do more and more and more. And then we think, okay, if I'm looking at my phone and I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and you said to me the other day, we're just jerks looking at each other's phone, looking at the phone when we're talking, right? And that's part of the inability to realize that time in terms of hours is a concept. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So I would say that StoicDan is onto something in the sense that is missing from contemporary Stoic circles, and the idea of, we talk a lot about, for example, the ethics of those virtues. What we don't talk about is how to be present, because in Stoicism, we only have the present in the same way that other wisdom traditions might. And it doesn't mean that Stoicism is incorrect. So that's just not, I haven't found that to be a particular focus, probably because in the Roman and the ancient Greek period, this wasn't such a red button topic on every person's day. But I would be reluctant to add it as a virtue. But I'm happy to have pushback, as you know. Sharon and I really went at it last year. So I don't know if StoicDan.
And look at you now, you're working happily together. It's beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, StoicDan and I get on really well, and we share a lot of the ideas. And I can see him playing devil's advocate, which is something I haven't done today particularly. So I like what he's doing. Again, and it's wonderful because, yeah, there is unfortunately this view that if I feel that traditional viewpoint is the one that we should stick to, therefore I must dislike StoicDan, or therefore I must dislike a secular, somebody who's, they might say, oh, I never want to read anything that Kai writes because he's not a secular Stoic. And I'm like, that's really disappointing, because not necessarily because of Kai's, but the inability for us as in society to open our minds up. Maybe I disagree with StoicDan about 5 virtues. That doesn't mean that his idea isn't worth listening to. Because that's the point of Stoicism, to be able to take the first impression and weigh it up, right, and having a debate. And I do think I would encourage Dan to develop that further, because I do think in Stoicon 2022 that is something worthy of being said. Now, how I would frame it would be different, but it doesn't mean the message is quote unquote useless. I don't know, StoicDan, if you want to push back at me at any point.
Well, actually, I'll mention briefly that in my groups in Florida, as well as other groups I visited, like the Minnesota Stoics, the Berlin Stoics, I'm glad to say that they have rich discussions about these topics, and they do criticize each other. They are being open-minded and agreeing to disagree sometimes. I'm glad to see that some groups have adopted that format so that they can really develop their minds, not just listen to someone about Stoicism for an hour, but really develop their minds on the topic.
Well, I only have one more question that I want to ask, and then Kai, if you have another one, absolutely fine with that. But Kai, you mentioned something there which I think is really important. You talk about, a few hundred years ago, they did not have this concept of time like we have it, and they would measure things in, this activity or that activity. One thing that I've been really fascinated by lately, there's a really brilliant thinker in Canada called Jonathan Pageau. Now, he's an Orthodox Christian, and he is trying to reinvigorate the kind of old world view of Christianity that has embedded with it a very kind of cosmological perspective, and just pointing out the fact that to go to something like the Bible with a scientific mind is the complete wrong way to approach this book, right? And there's a certain way that they approached it back then. And I mean, built into the structure of Christianity is this narrative that society comes into alignment with God and comes into alignment and comes into a certain relationship with God, perhaps through the way that we see and experience everything around us, but then we fall away from that naturally. And that's when things go terribly, and then we all come back to that. It's kind of this recurring cycle. But the most interesting thing that I get from Jonathan Pageau is his insistence that you can inhabit a completely different way of seeing the world around you if you're able to participate in the ritual, participate in the learning of these ancient narratives in the way that they were supposed to be learned. And I can't help but think that that is in part a challenge that we also have with the Stoic community today, where we actually need to learn how to see the world as the Stoics saw the world, which is impossible, of course, because we're in a different time and place, and we're here and we're not there. But I wonder if either of you have any recommendations for books or resources or practices, anything that you might recommend to people in order to get them, I guess, closer to the Stoics. This might be a book of philosophy, certainly, but I mean, could be for history or anything that can just get you closer to understanding how the kind of world view that they lived in back then.
Well, I'll say one of my favorite books is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. And we don't think of him today as a Stoic, but he was influenced by the Stoics. We know that this happened because it's in his journal entries. We know that he read the Stoics. And one of the things from chapters 1 and 2 in that book that is really amazing that comes through is his love of nature. The way he watches the birds and the little creatures in the forest. And I know we can criticize maybe he wasn't so far from town when he was living out there in the cabin, but nonetheless, his love of nature is something that I think can help us today get in touch more with our world, because there is so much we can learn from nature. There's another field of science called emergence science, where we're learning about, like, why do all these fireflies, which you collect in a tent, why are they all blinking at different rates, but by morning, they're all blinking together? There is no queen of the fireflies, so how does that happen? And in a colony of ants, when you see the ants dragging some piece of food back to the colony, there's always a few ants that are pulling in the wrong direction. Why are those guys doing that? Why are they just contrarian? But somehow the ant colony always gets its food. Enough of them are going in the right direction. We can learn from these things in emergence.
I love that answer. Certainly. Yeah, Walden. Oh my gosh. What a powerful book. But Kai, anything that you recommend there?
I think as we cannot be Romans, I would ask people to think about the complexity of their own lives. And I would say something like, whenever we feel the need to judge historically, right, we have to think about where in our own life we have wanted to do the right thing, or what we thought was the right thing, but we felt that we were powerless to do so. So we might say, I would love to give up my fossil fueling car. However, no one else is doing that. However, there's no, 20 years ago, there's not really an electric car that will do this. And I don't really want to walk because I don't want to get wet in the rain. So I think the best way to understand the Romans is to understand your own humanity, and how many times, and I include myself in this, and we might say, for example, we often say, how dare the Stoics condone slavery, and yet we buy clothes from sweatshops, which is, in many ways, we don't agree with slavery. No, but very few people would say today, you know what, I really agree with slavery. But very few people, when you think about it, in the way that we do things, actively say and mean by their actions, I think it's absolutely abhorrent and I would never have any part whatsoever to do with it. And then you point to the clothes they're wearing, you point to the chocolate in their cupboard, which is made by child labor, if it's from Western Africa or Brazil. And you say, but well, at least now you've listened to this podcast and you now know that a great deal of chocolate is produced by children in forced labor or stuff in your telephone. So you don't agree with slavery, but you don't condemn it as quickly as you might think. And by buying into that, by doing the only thing that you can in that situation. So, for example, if you might say, I've had this argument on Facebook, but I don't own a slave ship, and I would never do that. Okay, you don't own one. So what do you own? Do you own a chocolate bar? Yes. So the one thing you could have done to prevent that slavery from occurring is to not buy into that particular chocolate. Now, I caught myself doing it the other day, right? So I was in the supermarket, I looked up and I thought, very British, bloody hell, that chocolate is expensive, right? So, because it was fair trade, which is an independent label that certifies that chocolate is not, the chocolate produced is not done so using slave labor. And I caught myself, and I said in third person because I caught myself in my head because I was in public space. Kai, do you know why that chocolate's so expensive? Because it doesn't involve child labor. So I was thinking about it all week, right? And yet, when I was in the supermarket, I thought, oh my gosh, it's £1 more than the more common alternative. And why is it £1 more? Because it says something about how we run our economy. So I would say the best way to know the Romans is to know yourself before. And it's not like we can't learn from or gain insights. So it's go, okay, we prefer to have a situation where the economy is not run this way. And, the Romans never seemed to realize that was a major problem. But we realize there are issues of injustice here, even if they didn't. And yet today we still have it. And that to me is the best way to sort of learn about humanity in general, to sort of pick yourself apart, to catch yourself in the supermarket going, do you know why it's more expensive? And then it's a choice, isn't it? And then people might say, yeah, but I can't afford to, pay extra. And then the question is, and Leonidas said it to me, do you need chocolate to survive in the same way? You can't go out your house without a t-shirt on, but you can survive without chocolate.
Well, you could go out of your house without a t-shirt on, but maybe some of us shouldn't, But,
yeah. You couldn't go out your house naked, or you shouldn't. It's much more difficult to argue that. But it's very hard for me to argue. But I really need my chocolate every day, and that's the point. The reason why it's cheap is because we want it every day, and nobody thinks caviar should be cheaper, for example, because it's something different. So maybe if we saw chocolate as a thing we'd have every week, we wouldn't be so reluctant, including myself, to go, whoa, that's much more expensive than I imagined. So that's how I would say it's the best way to learn about the Romans, because we can't be them.
Yeah, certainly. I love that answer. And Kai, I wonder if you want to do the honors, any last questions for Stoic Dan here before we ask him to share with us how people can get in touch and get involved in what he's doing?
Yes. What is the one thing in the contemporary Stoic community we should be talking about and we're not?
In a contemporary Stoic
community. So within the Stoic community, what is the one overarching theme we should be talking about, but we're not?
I can reach back to my first Stoicon conference in Toronto, 2017. One of the speakers there was Chuck Chakrapani, and he talked about how Stoicism has all these different tools available, but you do not learn them one after another like climbing a staircase. He said, you can practice Stoicism like a symphony. All the tools are playing at once. I think that is a beautiful metaphor that is not repeated enough. And I think that it's a great example that a beginner can attend a meeting and just learn one or two things and take it with them. And that can be good for the first week. But after a year, you may have your whole symphony playing and your life will be far, far more smooth and improved.
Amazing. Well, Dan, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure to have you here for the first time, and I can guarantee that we'll be doing this again. And if you just want to share with the audience who's listening, how can people get involved with what you're doing? If they're living over in Florida, how can they get in touch with you to come and join your meetups?
Sure. There's a lot to say, but in brief, they can go to my website, StoicDan.com. It has a list of all the all the groups that I'm the organizer of. The latest group that I stepped up to be organizer of is called Socrates Cafe, based in Tampa. They're just meeting online right now, but their previous organizer had to step down because of personal schedule reasons. So I'm organizing 7 groups now, but Orlando Stoics is the most active. They have meetings 4 days a week, and new lectures are on Sundays. So there's so much to tune in for people who want to learn about Stoicism, these related areas that I like connecting, and then new topics like Panpsychism we are including on Sundays. All of these groups that I've mentioned are on Meetup, so you can Google meetup.com with Orlando Stoics or Socrates Cafe, and you can find them. I'm also glad to say that I'm still doing interviews with scholars in the modern movement. And those interviews end up on my website as Medium pages. They're published by the Stoic Fellowship. So I'm very glad to still be doing those, one interview a quarter. And then, of course, my YouTube channel. For those of you who like any of the topics you've heard here today, you can just Google in YouTube search box StoicDan and any of these terms, and there's hundreds of videos on YouTube now. So everyone can enjoy, leave comments. I love hearing from people. I get usually some suggestion every day. So it's always giving me new ideas for where to go next.
Brilliant. StoicDan, thank you so much. Kai, thanks for coming along too. This has been amazing, and I look forward to next time. You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to thewalledgarden.com. See you there.